I think playing is very important. Every child hopefully plays. I think it's an international, is it the Declaration of Human something or other? You're allowed the right to play as a child. I think that's where all the artistry comes from. So rather than it being a literary beginning for me, I think it was having a vivid and rich, imaginative play life, which really is what being a writer is about.
That was the voice of author, professor, and world traveler Deborah Pike, and it is my absolute delight to have her on as the guest of this episode of the Page&Stage Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon. And a quick apology about the sound quality of my voice in this episode. Deb sounds great, but a tech gremlin of some sort was apparently ambushing my mic during recording, so I sort of sound like I'm in an underwater echo chamber. Now, fortunately, Deb talks a lot more than I do in the next 50 or so minutes, so hopefully it isn't too annoying. But rest assured, I am always battling the tech gremlins, and future episodes should have me back to sounding far more sonorous. Now, before diving into my conversation with Deb, a brief Page&Stage plug. This podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. Go check out pageandstage.art. That's pageandstage.art. And there you'll find not just every previous episode of this podcast, but also the archive of my weekly newsletter, which is full of tips and tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. You can sign up for free and get the newsletter directly into your inbox each Friday, as well as every new podcast right into your inbox every other Monday. And everything is free, but if you find value in all this storytelling content, you can financially support me at pageandstage.art or forward any of the newsletters or podcasts to other story-loving friends, or hire me outright as your personal story coach. So if you're working on a memoir, play, or speech, shoot me an email at jason@pageandstage.art. I cannot wait to hear your story. Now, let me tell you a bit more about my awesome guest, Deb Pike. She is a writer and academic currently based in Sydney, Australia. She grew up in Perth, Western Australia. She obtained a first-class honors degree in English literature from the University of Western Australia and a PhD from the University of Sydney, and is now an associate professor of English literature at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, Sydney campus. Deb is a winner of an Australian Government Award for University Teaching, a citation for teaching literature as a transdisciplinary practice. She has traveled widely and even lived in Paris for several years, where she held positions at Shakespeare and Company Bookstore, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the University of Paris 7, and the Paris Institute of Political Studies. Deb is the author of The Subversive Art of Zelda Fitzgerald, which was shortlisted for an Australian Award in Literary Criticism. She has also co-edited 2 volumes of scholarly essays, and her specialist research area is literary modernism. She is currently working on a nonfiction book for Bloomsbury Academic London entitled Modernism Beyond the Canon, and her debut novel, The Players, was released in April of this year, and it would make a wonderful holiday gift for the literary fiction lover in your circle. Here we go with my conversation with Deb Pike. Okay, this episode is really cool because I'm engaging in literal time travel. I am online on Monday evening with Deb. Do you prefer Deborah or Deb? How should I
Deb
refer
is
to you?
absolutely fine.
Deb. I am here with author, teacher, world traveler, Deb Pike. She is in Australia. It's Monday evening for me, and it's Tuesday morning for her. It's literal time travel on the Page&Stage podcast today. Deb, thank you so much for getting up early as I'm getting ready to have dinner.
It's a pleasure. I'm an early riser as well, so it's easy.
Perfect. All right, so Deb, I want to start with, so you and I met on Upwork. You hired me to help you craft a blurb for your debut novel, which we're going to get to, The Players. And in the course of communicating all over email, this is our first time seeing each other and actually talking live. So cool. But in the course of this, you have taught me some Australian slang, some words that I did not know what they meant. And my favorite was chuffed, I believe. And I would love for you to explain to the listeners, my mostly American listeners, I'm sure, what does chuffed mean?
Oh, chuffed is a lovely word. It means very pleased, delighted. I actually think perhaps it's an English word, but yes, it's wonderful to be chuffed. It sort of has a fluffy feeling, doesn't it? You sort of feel fluffy and chuffed.
It's almost bordering on onomatopoetic. Like the
That's
sound of
right.
it is like. So, Dad, we're gonna get to your novel, like I said, but first, you grew up in Australia, but you've lived in Paris. You've traveled the world. Your book travels all over the world. Talk a little bit about what drew you to go off and study in lands unknown. What took you from Australia to Paris to anywhere else you've been? What is that part of why you became a storyteller and writer? Is that part of your spirit, this traveling thing? I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your traveling and your world experiences.
Traveling is great for a writer, I think. Most definitely, my travels have fed into the stories that I tell. I was fortunate to do a teaching exchange to Paris during my doctoral studies at Sydney University. So I began doing some teaching in Paris at a university there, Paris 7, which was a wonderful experience. And I traveled to many different parts of Europe during that experience. I've traveled to researching for various books, including one on Zelda Fitzgerald. So I had a very interesting and informative time working in America as well. It is my time in Paris that stays with me most closely, I think. Definitely the teaching experiences. It was wonderful to experience teaching students who were very different to what I'd experienced in Australia. Paris 7 was a wonderful institution because people were able to attend from all over the place, and it's a free education. So they were very diverse. It was very challenging. I was quite terrified at first because I think they thought I was a bit of a pushover. The French love slapstick and physical comedy, and I think I was the source of great hilarity for them when I first arrived there. I was so nervous, I was dropping my papers and the chalk was breaking on the blackboard and I couldn't get them to pay attention at all. And so it was English grammar was the big subject I taught in the English department there. And I remember one day being so overwhelmed by these students that I went to speak to the superior, as they call it. Professeur Claude Rivière was his name, and he was quite intimidating himself. And I remember knocking on his office door and entering a room that was shrouded in smoke as he sat there smoking his cigarette. And he
Very
just,
Parisian.
that's right. And he just said, look, you're too easy on them. You have to be mean. And he pushed under my nose this volume of English grammar that was written entirely in French and said I had to give them teach them that. Anyway, that was quite an experience, and a different one teaching at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, which was incredible. A very different institution where students were under enormous pressure to perform. Their parents were very pushy generally. A lot of French presidents went through that school as well. They're both were very testy students, each place I taught. I was a couple of years at each place, but I won them over, I think, just through games and play, not in a frivolous sense, but through role playing and just really getting them active. But I also worked too in Paris at Shakespeare and Company bookstore. I don't know if you know it.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
You do?
yeah.
It is a fabulous, famous, wonderful bookstore. I did the 12 to 4 shift for almost a year, which was just so much fun. I was there just after Sylvia Whitman had taken over from her father, George Whitman, and she brought a really new energy and vigor to the shop, which I think today it's thriving. Back when I worked there, it was quieter and, I could conduct my social life from the bookstore, which, eat cheese and baguette on the sidewalk, which I'm not sure there would be time there now. It's very, very busy. But she's done wonderful things with that place where there were lots of writers. And so, yes, I worked in lots of different places in France and even at the OECD, where I edited books on topics I knew very little about, which I had to learn quickly about, like trade and commerce and governance. But what I loved about that work was having lunch in the Château de la Mouette, which is the headquarters, which was once a hunting lodge for French princes. And I think Marie Antoinette swanned about the gardens there. And there were conferences and famous people would appear, like the Prince of Monaco. And that was very exciting. So I have to say, out of all my travels, and I've been far and wide, not everywhere. I'd love to go to South America, for example. I have had an ongoing love affair, like many people, with Paris. So I've been very fortunate. So yes, this has fed into my writing, into my thinking, the people I've met, the lectures I've attended, the poetry readings, the DJ nights, any kind of. So.
Yeah, there's something about, so two things you just said that really, really stuck with me. One, that when you were editing topics you didn't know a lot about. I've had to do that too. Like one of my recent clients was a very high ranking dental, a guru. Like she was starting a conference for dentists and had to give a keynote. And so I'm like, oh, I can help you write a really good speech, but I have to go research this really. I don't know anything other than sit in the chair, right? So to do these deep dives, it's almost like its own form of travel. You're doing almost like an intellectual travel. You have to go, you said you had to edit a book on commerce. I mean, how quickly can you, it's like, I wish we were the Matrix. You can just download the information really quickly to edit it. So that was one thing that stuck with me because I've experienced that same thing. But two, you said travel made you a better writer. And I think we can all intellectually go, yeah, of course. But can you dig into that a little bit? Like a specific example or two of how being somewhere foreign to you, right? Foreign is subjective, right? Experiencing something new or diverse or different, how in a specific way has that affected you as a writer or even as a professor?
I think you become more curious. Obviously, the place, if you've never been there before, is all new and you have a child's eyes more likely. And that freshness of vision and perception, I think, makes for better writing. And I think our brains are just stimulated by newness and difference. And we note what is our own responses and our own emotions and observations, I think, are perhaps more vivid because of the difference. The risk with that is depicting something superficially or just with a tourist's gaze, which is a problem. But if you are going to depict a place, obviously not just experiencing it, but if you don't know it that well, but reading about it and reading the literature around it and speaking to people, I think is very important. But I think writers thrive on different environments. But even your own familiar environment, which people do write about what they know and places they love and the places they grew up and the intensity of that familiarity, I think they bring to it a freshness of vision or a newness, which is great for writers. Do you find that, Jason, because you're a writer too?
Yeah, I loved what you said about the trap of the tourist's gaze, as opposed to what you're talking about here, which is really finding a way to see something with new or fresh eyes, with the wonderment, not because a tourist is there to kind of take something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as a writer, we're offering something. We're offering a different perception or perspective, especially like you just said, on the thing we know so well. How can I take something I know so well and yet offer it with a twist to a reader who maybe has never been here, but when I offer it to them, they'll still get it. right? As opposed to like the tourist, which is like the tourist gaze is an Instagram post, right? It's a brochure.
Correct.
We want your money
Mm.
as opposed to we want you to be stimulated.
Yeah, or to glean something more soulful or more accurate. In my own writing, in depicting places I don't know very well, where I have done a lot. I mean, I can do research for a long time, and perhaps only 3 or 4 words from that research will appear in the final draft of what I'm trying to do. But
Yeah.
it'll have the ring of something a bit truer. But I mean, superficial things like the scent of a place or things that we might ignore in our own more regular environments are good to capture as well. So I suppose not everything has to be deep and profound.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the other side of the trap.
That's right. I mean, what I love about travel and writing is that, you know, I think you're kind of courting serendipity. If you're walking through new places, these chance encounters can feed their way into the things we think about, the things we create. And there can be some really lovely synchronicities. And I think there are certain spaces, even being deep in nature, which give rise to gifts, to use your words earlier, that they become creative gifts that we can feed into our work, that can become a kernel for a moment or a scene or a thought.
Yeah, this is so great. We're kind of geeking out, but I love it.
Geek away. I'm
Yeah.
a proud geek.
What? So we're gonna get to the players and your fiction debut here in a second. But your career path was one of academia, creativity, literature, teaching, academic writing. What drew you down that direction in the first place? Were you an avid reader as a child? Was there a particular book or moment where you knew I need to go into literature? Before you became a fiction writer, what drew you into this aspect of storytelling and wanting to go teach, go travel? There had to be something that kind of, whenever I have a theater guest on, because that's the biggest part of my background, there's always that moment where they knew they wanted to be in the theater. I'm curious if there's a similar moment in your background where you knew you had to be in the world of literature.
It came to me quite late, actually. I was studying law and found myself writing poems and getting very bored. And
For my
I
closing argument, I have a sonnet.
that's right. They were not nearly as highfalutin as that. They were kind of absurdist poems that, you know, were not very good, probably. And I think I picked up some subjects by accident in literature. I wasn't meant to do them, but there was a conflict with the timetable. So I just sort of took up a course in contemporary literature. And I found that I really loved it. And I just got into it. And I got into reading quite late. I mean, I did read as a child. I grew up in quite a cultural home. My mother was a director, producer, and choreographer. So there was always music and there was always theater and mayhem and noise and beating of drums. But my parents were great readers as well. But I think they were too impatient and busy and to read to me or anything, anything like that. So I really found it on my own. But I worked in bookstores to support my studies. And I found I loved being around books. And I don't know, I sort of fell into it. I do remember a moment sitting in the office of one of my professors and looking around the room and thinking, gosh, this is the life, isn't it? Surely. I think that's how it happened. I think it's also a life where you can combine a lot of things, where you can meet different people, research nerdy topics. It allows you to explore different things. It's a wonderful life, really, working in academia. But it of course has its own pressures and drawbacks and stresses, which I'm sure you, having taught in higher education or colleges and universities, must be familiar with. So hopefully that's a long-winded answer to your question. So multiple reasons. in some ways, I feel like I just sort of ended up. I just ended up doing it somehow by default. But writing, right, I was always writing without really realizing it. I think playing is very important. Every child hopefully plays. I think it's an international, is it the Declaration of Human something or other? You're allowed the right to play as a child. I think that's where all the artistry comes from. So rather than it being a literary beginning for me, I think it was having a vivid and rich, imaginative play life, which really is what being a writer is about, in my view.
Grace and Deb, you were just talking about your journey into literature, and you mentioned something which I can relate to very much, which is balancing a creative life with the demands of the academic life. Right? I don't know if it's the same in Australia or Paris, but the whole publish or perish thing that happens in American academia, there's probably a similar vibe over there, where on the academic side, you're expected. I can speak to myself in my experience. Are you going to be on this committee? Are you going to go take care of the Senate? Are you going to put that article out there? As opposed to just, I need to focus on my students and make sure that they're getting what they need. It's why I didn't stick. I didn't stick in academia because I actually couldn't balance it very well. I became resentful of all the stuff that was demanded on the academic side. And that's not to judge it. It's just to own who I am. For you, especially now that because your novel is a big one. It's not a short novel. There is sweat equity like crazy in this book. How do you balance this creative, as you just said a second ago, playful life with all the demands of academia?
It's very difficult. Yes, it is a big novel. It's a commitment for readers. I fully acknowledge that. What it is, it's difficult. As you say, there are multiple demands. You have to do so much working in academia. And teaching is rewarding, immensely rewarding, but also can be exhausting. I'm at a teaching intensive institution. So while we do have research demands and service demands, teaching is the priority, which is great in some ways, but which does leave you feeling tired. So it's difficult practically to find the time to write, for example, a giant novel with 8 points of view and 10 years and 6 countries. I don't know. What was I thinking? Anyway, I did it, for better or for worse. You just have to make time. I booked time away to get out of ordinary life, and I got quite a lot written during COVID, but hopefully there won't be another COVID. A lot of people did a lot of writing during COVID. So, it was a productive time for creativity. So it's difficult. You have to make the time. The other difficulty is sort of methodological, because critical thinking, which is what the academy wants to get students doing and what you're meant to be doing, can be, not always, but can be at odds with the creative thinking. And in some ways they can be opposed to one another. So in the academy, it's all about knowledge, mostly. I find in creative practice, it's about entering into mystery without sounding too mystical. Lewis Hyde, whose work, The Gift, I adore, says that the passage of mystery refreshes and gifts rise from pools we cannot fathom. So going into a more mysterious space is what creativity often requires. And that's very different from producing knowledge and critical thought. So it's difficult. One of my characters in my novel, Veronica, she is an aspiring actress and she gets stuck in her head. And one of her lessons is that she learns that she needs to become more embodied, an embodied character, an embodied actor to be a more convincing actor. And she ends up finding inspiration in Margaret Edson's one-act play, Wit, where the main character, funnily enough, Vivian Baring, so close to the end of her life, realizes that the life of the mind has its limitations. So that was a deliberate element in the novel on my part. So I'm not saying that I've prioritized intellectual life, but I think it can be very rich, obviously, and satisfying. But I think I try to balance that with more embodied creative experiences if I can. So I don't know if I've answered your question. Just to say
Absolutely.
that it's difficult, and just to being constantly mindful of the tug between the two. I don't think they're entirely mutually incompatible, but they can be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it has to do with assumptions that are made about the nature of what is a human, the mess inside us, how things are expressed. I love the idea of it of having to enter into mystery though, because that can be terrifying for an academic. No, the whole point is to
Right.
eliminate mystery. That's the whole to eliminate mystery, right? But no, sometimes for the creative act, inspiration, we still don't understand exactly what it is or how it works. When the muse passes, whatever your favorite metaphor is, whether it's spiritual, religious, whatever, we still don't have a clear definition or algebraic equation that defines it. And for some people, that's terrifying. For some people, that's freeing, and everything in between. But yeah, in a way, you have to almost code switch. I think maybe like if you're in class, then go to your time, or I don't know. I know I was experiencing that where to go from classroom time to a committee meeting, I'd almost have to take a moment to put on go into a different headspace to go to rehearsal. I need to almost channel change, give myself permission now. I love what you said. To okay, I'm putting certainty aside, and I have to go step into the mystery because I'm about to go play with a bunch of young actors who know far less about theater than I do, and we have to build something together.
How exciting, though! Isn't that what
Oh
that's
yeah,
the point of
it's
existence? Surely, isn't it?
exhilarating, but in that scary way. You mentioned, okay, this is great. Perfect pivot. You mentioned your book having 8 points of view. So for everyone out there, the book is called The Players. It's about a group of university students who gather together in an orchard in a really hot summer, and they're going to kind of self-produce this student version of Marriage of Figaro. And one of the things that you do, Deb, is that each chapter is basically told from a different character's point of view. The narrative voice changes chapter by chapter. It's almost like there's 8 stories happening simultaneously, and you weave them together. So it's less about a strict timeline and more about these characters experiencing the same event in different ways. It's almost as if the event, Marriage of Figaro, Rehearsal in the Orchard, is this crystal that you're holding up to the light, and you just twist it and turn it, and the light refracts through in different ways, and each beam is a different character's understanding of that moment. I might be putting words in your mouth, but that's how I experienced it. And I just love that. This bouncing, this hopscotching between points of view. 3-part question. One, where did the book come from? Everyone wants to know, what was the initial spark, the idea for the book? Was it Marriage of Figaro? Was it an experience you actually had yourself in the mayhem of a theater? So where'd the book come from? Why Marriage of Figaro? Because I remember when you and I were working together, I really latched onto that as a key metaphorical driver for your blurb. And then third, why 8 points of view? What were you hoping to do by doing that wonderful, wonderful thing to the reader?
I'm glad you think it's wonderful. Not too. I mean, it asks the reader to hold quite a multiplicity there. Well, what was I trying to do, and where did I get the inspiration from? That's what you're asking.
Yeah, where'd the book come from? And now
Well,
follow up with the Marriage of Figaro, because that's fascinating too. But where'd the book come from, and why 8 points of view?
I had been in quite a lot of student theater when I was younger, and growing up too, at school as an adolescent and in my spare time. And I always had an absolute ball. It was so much fun. And I was really interested in the way in which a creative process, such as putting on a play, simply brings diverse people together, and how it affects them in the moment, for sure, but also for the rest of their lives through different connections and friendships, and the way in which a text can travel and reverberate in a moment and also throughout your life. I being a literary person, I think we are made up of texts sometimes. We call upon them, quotes and words, and referring to characters as almost templates. for existence, which might sound a bit extreme, but I was interested in exploring all those things. Also coming from a theatre family, I witnessed a bit of that in my mother putting on her shows. She did both amateur and professional productions. I was always really impressed with the way she liked to include as many different people as possible. And she would always cast unsuspectingly someone. She was a relentless talent scout. So she would, she'd find a taxi driver really interesting. And if he had a great voice or if he was singing, or she would think, gosh, here's my card. She loved musical theatre. She put on opera and some plays, but her passion was putting on, Les Miserables and Oklahoma and this sort of thing. So I saw from a distance what she was doing. I didn't get too involved because it is always mortifying having a parent in the public eye. I don't know. It's quite excruciating. You want nothing to do with it, even though you're very proud. So I was influenced, obviously, by that. I certainly didn't take acting further than amateur explorations into my early 20s because I could see the people who really were good at it were not like me. they just had a determination and a grit and a kind of muscular way of approaching the world that I really, it wasn't quite me. But I always loved it. So that inspired me. And I always wanted to explore it. So that inspired me. Why 8 points of view? I don't know. I just kind of, it just kind of happened. It is my first novel. I think my next work will be a kind of haiku or something very small. Or a very sort of quiet, terse, pared down novella where it's just very slight. But this, I definitely wanted to capture many voices as an ensemble narrative. So it's an ensemble narrative, it's ensemble reading. And I didn't want to have a story that presented culturally homogenous characters. I grew up with people who were from all over. So there's Veronica, who's the daughter of a Czech immigrant. We've got Joshua, who's a laborer. Felix, an exchange student from Germany. Sebastian and Cassandra from privileged families. But I wanted to see how they all worked together and see what happens. Isn't that, what put all these ingredients into a pan.
Yeah,
Fry them.
It's not really a plot-driven book. It's character study.
It is.
I'm partly curious how much the characters just told you what was happening next. What was the first line you wrote, and when did you realize that you were no longer in control of what the characters were doing and saying?
Well, they definitely took over. I see the character narration as almost like a baton being passed. So the novel moves progressively forward, but we're given a different camera angle, I suppose, as the action moves forward. So this is how this person sees it, then this person, and someone responds, and then. So getting back to your question, the first line I think was quite early in the book where one of the main characters, Sebastian, encounters Veronica at his birthday party, and he wonders who she is. She's not meant to be there. She's looks different from everyone else, and she piques his curiosity because she's not like someone from his quite formal, stuffy world where he lives, in which he exists. So that was the beginning, I think. But there were different parts written at different moments. I was the rehearsal scene, the opening night or the closing night scene was an early scene I wrote. I wanted to start the book with the closing night, but it got too temporally confusing for readers for me to do that. So I had to start more quietly and just lead up to it. In a way, you have to lean in and sound out each of the characters before the momentum builds, which might seem counterintuitive when it comes to story structure. All I can say is that's the way it turned out. So, And yeah, I've had some great responses from people, people identifying with different characters and not liking others. And, that's what happens.
Talk a little bit about the publishing journey. So as someone working in academia, then taking on this first novel, because I get this question all the time. I run a little imprint, and so I've never done the agent route or, but you actually have like a publishing house and you had some events, and I'm curious what your publishing journey was. Did you get an agent? Did you send the manuscript out to a bunch of different publishers? How did you go from, okay, I've finished this thing, to, oh my gosh, I have a drop date?
It is truly amazing to be published. It took me about a year to find a publisher. At first, I sought out an agent because that's a great way to get your work out there. And of course, I don't have multiple personal connections with publishers like agents do. But it was not that easy. I had an agent hang on to the manuscript for about 9 months before he said no. And another one who got back to me very quickly, thankfully, it's only 3 weeks, and said, thanks, but no thanks. I was going to revisit the manuscript, and then I realized that I just didn't have the time. Sure, I could begin it in Paris and reverse the structure and kill a few characters, but I couldn't. I just didn't have the time. And it was so heavily kind of colonizing in my consciousness that I actually needed it to be out of my life. So I emailed a couple of publishers, one that never got back to me, and another that got back to me immediately, a Western Australian publisher, because half of the book is set there. Fremantle Press said, yes, we love it. We're going to run with it. And I think because the sense of place is so strong there, that they felt that it really fitted with their list. That is how it worked. I know in the United States, you can't approach publishers directly. Is that correct? You need an agent always. Is that?
It's really tough. It depends on the size of the publisher. Like, I'm just a little independent one, so I don't require an agent. But if you want any of the big five, or if you want to have any chance of like New York Times bestseller, and also, of course, the self-publishing movement, the last, 10, 20 years has really altered the landscape in terms of how anyone wants to put something out there. They can, but what do people assume about it? So all those things are kind of in play. I have found that I offer my services mostly to first-time authors, and they tend to be memoirists. For whatever reason, that's the lane that sort of manifested for me. But yeah, I reached out to an agent, I think once or twice, and just like, I just want to put it out there. That wasn't necessary for me to get what I needed from the experience. So I think that's probably different for each writer too. I totally understand what you meant about having to get it out of your life. Like, it's taking up this huge amount of bandwidth, even though it's done. Because the writing is almost the easy part. Then you have to go sell it.
I didn't really think that through, to be honest. I hadn't thought, the other side. You think, it's gone, great. And it's like, oh no, you got to push your book. You got to put it in a wheelbarrow and travel around with it, Yes. So, but yeah, that's true. It is really difficult to get published by a traditional publisher. At Fremantle Press, I'm very lucky, an independent publisher and very well respected. So that was a bit of I just feel extremely fortunate. But self-publishing is a brilliant way to go, and your imprint looks fantastic. Oh. I think more and more people are accepting self-publishing as entirely legitimate.
Yeah. Like, who are the gatekeepers and why are they the gatekeepers? And I was literally just having lunch with a couple people who ran a publishing company here in town for a while. It was like a thriller mystery imprint, and they sold it off. And we were talking, and they talked about how they went to New York and were trying to meet with the big publishers, and they finally got a meeting, and they walked in ready to kind of ask advice. And the big publisher looked at them and said, "You're so lucky. You get to publish what you want. Here, when the stakes are so high, we have to publish the ones we know will sell. We can't publish the books we love. We have to publish the books we know will sell." So again, what the motor is completely changes sort of based on where you are. And these publishers let this meeting going, oh, maybe we don't need advice from the big five, because we're doing what we love for who we love with authors we love. And some of them make a living, and what more can you ask for in a real way?
Well, that's right. And we can make assumptions that it's always better, one of the big five, but the reality can be quite different. Even when you hear authors speak, ones who've been published by the big five, can often express a preference for a smaller publisher or turn themselves to self-publishing. So, yes, the pressure to sell is obviously enormous. And there would be a compromise, I imagine, whether that means a compromise in the range of stories that are told and how they're told, in the literary qualities. I imagine it's also not that clear as well. I think at the same time, I don't know that any publisher really knows what's going to sell. Do you? I don't know much about publishing, but it must be a real, I mean, nobody knows really, do they? Do they?
And sometimes, I mean, you can read the tea leaves best you can and try to replicate the hit from last year, but sometimes things will catch you by surprise. I was meeting with a potential author today, and his story is like it's set in the world of baseball, and it's a little romantic comedy. It's really sweet, and he was a former baseball player, so that's why that's. But as he was doing his research and we kind of dug in, one of the top selling genres on Amazon right now is hockey romance. Like,
wow.
who could who could have guessed that, right? So anyone out there who's ever played hockey, go write your love story. You can go sell 10,000 copies on Amazon.
That's fantastic. Well, I wish him well. I think I've heard that romantasy is very big at the moment. I'm not quite sure what romantasy is, but
It's the whole Twilight genre. It's like werewolves and vampires
I'm
and
so
witches
behind.
and goblins who fall in love, and it's often very kind of teen focused. And yeah, romantasy is that.
Thanks.
All good. One last question about the players. I am so curious. I'm so curious because you're writing a book about university students coming together to put on a play. As the author, that play could have been any play. You could have chosen Shakespeare, Chekhov, O'Neill, a famous Australian play. You could have picked any play, and you chose Marriage of Figaro, and not the opera, but a play version of Marriage of Figaro. And I'm so curious why that was the play you selected to be kind of the motor, the instigation of this book.
The themes of that play are quite powerful, and they relate to the novel. So political intrigue, performativity, gender roles, the search for power, class conflict, all of these elements reverberate through my novel, and that play really encapsulates them really well. It's also quite playful play. It's a comedy. It's ludic. It's subversive. It has a wide cast, and I felt like it was a good one for capturing what I was trying to convey. I mean, I love French literature and theater as well. I've seen The Marriage of Figaro. Obviously, it's more famous for the opera, Mozart's beautiful opera. But I've seen the play a few times in Paris, in the Théâtre de Marais, which was wonderful. There were only 5 actors, I think, and they kept putting on new costumes, and it was a really athletic version that was just wonderful. And I saw it in the Playhouse at the Sydney Opera House a long time ago in full costume, and it just made a huge impression on me. And the themes definitely are still relevant today with all the kinds of conversations going on to do with power, diversity, representation, Me Too. And so I feel like it cuts across time as a play as well. I think you asked me that question earlier. I might have neglected it. I'm glad we came back to it. So.
Hey, Deb, we talked a little bit about the 8 points of view in the players, and I want to go one step past that now into this idea of the relationship between storyteller and reader. When I have classes, or I'm especially teaching memoir or fiction or playwriting, I talk to these often early career writers about how they have to think about this very carefully, that in theater, It's a real-time relationship, and it's a communal relationship. That it's a group of people having the same experience in the same 2 hours, in the same space-time, the same air. In a book, it's a one-to-one relationship, and it's asynchronous. Like if I write a book and you're reading it, I can't control when you read it, how fast you read it, whether you use a bookmark or dog ear the page or put it in your backpack or read outside or read inside. I have no control over how you temporally actually experience the story I wrote. So as that a storyteller, whether you're giving a speech, you're acting on stage, you're writing a play, you're writing a book, you have to keep in mind what that relationship is. Even this podcast right now, it's you and me talking, but it's not being projected into an auditorium, right? It's not a group experience on the radio. It's one person with probably earbuds or something in, and maybe they're doing dishes, or maybe they're on the treadmill. Like we can't control how people experience our conversation. So as you teach literature, and as you now as a writer put a book out there, I'm curious what you think about this idea of the relationship between receiver of story and giver of story, teller of story. How does that possibly enter into your pedagogy or into your writing process? Especially the fact that you have 8 points of view. That's, like you said, you're forcing the reader to hold multiple realities in mind simultaneously. You're demanding something of your reader. So I'm curious how you think about relationship between yourself as teacher, as a storyteller, and maybe student, receiver, reader. So that's a big, huge question, but I'm just kind of throwing that up to see what maybe that jostles out of your experience.
Well, it's actually the filmmaker, I think it was Andrei Tarkovsky, who said that if you have 1,000 people reading your book, you have 1,000 different stories, something like that. So everyone will read it differently and will read themselves into it differently. And that's been one of the wonderful things about the reader response to the book is they've been so varied. I've had people swear by one character and not the other and adore this character, and someone else, won't have even really paid attention to that character. And so it works in multiple ways. But in terms of thinking about the reader, obviously using elements of suspense and making your story, as engaging as you can, and learning the art and craft of storytelling is important. So there's that. On the other hand, you can't really care too much about your reader because you need to tell the story that you need to tell. And in a way, you can try and control how it lands, to use that expression, but you can't. You can know all the tricks of the trade, but the most important thing is to convey the vision that you have or you had. It doesn't mean it can't be improved or amended or adapted, but you need to honor it as the storyteller. So I think that actually comes first, for me anyway. And you can't, with creative work, I mean, whatever, you're putting together a painting or a play or a song or a memoir, or I think the process has to be its own reward. Because if you are focused on the reader or the listener or the outcome too much, then you'll go kind of crazy, really. You'll sort of you'll lose it. I mean, I think we have, this is what I experience. I have such little control over that. You can do questionnaires and interviews afterwards. Which bit did you like? Was this successful? But I don't know. I mean, obviously you have to listen, but your first, I think your first responsibility is to the thing you create.
That's awesome. I think that's amazing. It reminds me of something you said back in the first segment about part of your process is simply courting serendipity. It's both for your own work. You're almost creating the circumstance under which inspiration may strike. And then same thing, you give that book off to a reader and you can't control it. Your hope isn't a strategy, but you're courting serendipity. You're hopeful that whatever their experience is, it's close enough to what you intended, but also that it's meaningful to them in whatever way it needs to be at that time. Like I've had the privilege of playing the same character years apart. in the Rivals, I played Captain Absolute once in college and then once professionally, like 6 years later. And to have that experience, I know directors who've directed 12th Night 3 times over the course of 30 years, and it's a different production every time, as it has to be, as it should be. I think this is kind of what you're pointing at, is that there's a context, there's a release. It's the mystery, right? As you hand that book off, it's a mystery how that reader will receive it.
I think so. Well, for me, it is. It's a grand mystery. So, and yeah.
Yeah, and being willing to just accept, to live in the mystery.
To live in the mystery. Yeah. I mean, we have to. I mean, otherwise we become control freaks, and then we kind of start eating ourselves or something, like a little Pac-Man or something, or I don't know. I'm revealing my age now by talking about Pac-Man, but like there's this sort of self-cannibalizing that happens or whatever, or we kind of destroy things if we try and control them too much. But I mean, that might be challenging. I mean, you're a director. I mean, I've never directed anything, but I imagine sort of letting go is it part of that? Must be a huge thing. Or huge trust. I mean, trust is really, but you talked about hope. Hope is really important. And I think we keep believing in hope, but trust is also obviously an element that you trust the reader. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's partly trusting the team, but also trusting yourself that you did the work, right? I mean, directing is all about letting go. I have to give the play away to the actors and to the designers, and then we have to give it away to the audience. And there's that wonderful moment on the final rehearsal where now it's going to be opening night, and the director goes from having all the power in the room to having none, like that. Instantaneously.
It's a wonderful exercise in emptiness and in and it's good for us, I think, to be emptied out. We don't like it,
then you
of course.
Can refill.
Sorry,
but you can't refill if you don't empty out, right?
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, Deb, I could just keep talking all this for hours.
Oh,
I've got to wrap with you, though.
Yeah, so could I.
So I always like to wrap with 2 pieces of advice and a spotlight. So we'll start with advice number 1. What is the best advice that you have ever taken?
I've ever taken there's advice I've taken, and there's advice that I would like to take. Or I wish I'd taken. I had some good advice from my dear friend Rita Kalnies, who is a playwright and a screenwriter. She wrote the multi-award-winning film Baby Teeth, which stars Ben Mendelsohn, and she's had a wonderful career in screenwriting. And I was talking about one of my characters to her, the villainous character of Charlie. I was saying, I don't like him, and he's a scoundrel, and it's just, he's the worst, the worst of the worst. And she stopped me mid-sentence and said, don't do this. Don't judge your characters. You've got to stop. You've got to honor your character. Your character makes sense to themselves. And I thought that was great advice. So I hopefully took that in my work. I think it comes out in the depiction of character, that I'm not judging them. That was good advice. The other lovely advice, which is recent advice, is from she's a Jungian analyst, Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She's famous for many books. And I was listening to a lecture. She was talking about creativity. And she said, no matter how bad it gets, no matter how many doors are closed to you, or how many disasters you have with whatever it is you're creating, or maybe no one bought anything at your exhibition, or no one read your book, or you can't get this thing off the ground that you've been sitting there for 20 years and you can't, it won't move. Or she said there's always an aperture or an opening. There's always, you just have to keep pushing. And she uses the example of, maybe not such a great example, of the tree of heaven, which is a tree that grows anywhere, like a garbage dump, or in the most desperate of places, in the driest valley. There'll be a branch, there'll be a leaf. And she's absolutely convinced that with 7 billion people in the world, or that there's always an opening for your work, for whatever you create, for what you produce. And it's just holding on to that hope. So I think that's lovely as well.
That's gorgeous. Yeah. Great. All right. We got to flip it now. What is the worst advice that you have ever given?
Yeah. So I was trying to think on this question before, and I'm a great believer in follow your vision, honor your vision. But I was advising a student once, and I was, follow your vision, honor your vision. I loathe being micromanaged. And so I didn't do any micromanaging of this person. And she carried on following her vision, not with no guidance from me, but I let her lead, and it led to disaster.
Oh, no.
It was a dreadful experience for both of us. And I think, no one died. It's relative. I'm exaggerating, but a disappointment, shall we say. And I think, yes, honor your vision, but honor your vision and have guidance is what I learned from that. So don't blindly follow your vision, I suppose is what I've learned. So perhaps I ill-advised someone in that, if that answers your question, because I hopefully am not dishing out bad advice, but perhaps underripe or unfinished advice or impulsive advice rather than really, really bad advice. That sounds very self-exonerating, doesn't it? But that's the best answer I can give.
Oh, that's great. Deb, thank you so much. This has been great. It's time for a spotlight for you. If people want to learn more or buy your book, where can they track you down, meet you, learn more, hear more?
My website is deborahpike.com. You can find everything there. The book is available on Amazon if you're in the US, and in Australia, you can buy it straight from Fremantle Press.
Fantastic. And everybody, I'll put all those direct links right in the show notes, so it's easy to go track down The Players and Deb Pike all the way over in Australia. Deb, thank you so much for rising early and joining me today. Thank you for sending me a copy of your book afterward. It was just such a wonderful read. I encourage everyone, if you like character study and you like diving into what drives people, their emotions, their dreams, their challenges, it's like almost like a fever dream or a tone poem at times. And I think you'll really, really enjoy it. But thank you so much for your time and for giving us such lovely advice today.
Oh, thank you, Jason. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. It's been wonderful.
You've been listening to the Page&Stage Podcast. All my thanks to this week's guest and to all of you out there for listening. If you enjoyed or found value in this podcast, please tell at least one other person. Word of mouth has always been and will always be the best marketing tool in the world. You can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects in the show notes. And hey, feel free to send me your thoughts, your comments, your questions at jason@pageandstage.art. I always love to hear from you, and I might just even feature your questions on future episodes. This podcast is built with Alitu, the all-in-one podcasting app created by the amazing team over at thepodcasthost.com. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.